It was a breezy Wednesday evening in downtown Los Angeles, the kind of night where the city buzzed with energy. The Golden Spoon, a posh restaurant known for its upscale clientele and immaculate decor, was no exception. The restaurant brimmed with life tables filled with finely dressed guests, the gentle hum of conversation blending with soft piano music, and servers moving gracefully between tables, balancing silver trays laden with gourmet dishes. Into the scene walked a man who seemed completely out of place, or so it appeared to Kevin, the restaurant's ever-watchful manager. Kevin was a man who prided himself on maintaining the image of his establishment. He had a knack for sizing people up at a glance, and tonight, his eyes locked onto Will Smith as soon as he entered. Will wasn't dressed to impress that evening. He wore a plain gray hoodie, a pair of jeans, and sneakers that looked like they had seen better days. No flashy watches or designer labels, no entourage of bodyguards or assistants trailing behind him. He carried himself casually, his hands tucked into his hoodie pockets, and a calm smile resting on his face. He walked in quietly, almost unnoticed by the other diners, who were too busy sipping wine and discussing business deals to glance his way. But not Kevin. No one entered the Golden Spoon without him noticing. He had an instinct for spotting anyone who, in his words, might disrupt the atmosphere. And to Kevin, Will looked like trouble or, at the very least, someone who didn't belong. Kevin's brows furrowed as he straightened his tie and strode towards Will with practiced authority. To the staff, Kevin was a perfectionist. To the guests, he was the face of hospitality. But to those he deemed unworthy of the Golden Spoon's refined air, he was something else entirely: cold, dismissive, and, at times, downright rude. Will, on the other hand, was unfazed as Kevin approached. He stood at the hostess podium, his relaxed demeanor a stark contrast to Kevin's stiff professionalism. "Good evening," Kevin began, his voice smooth but laced with condescension. "Can I help you, sir?" Will gave him a polite smile. "Yeah, I'd like a table for one, please." Kevin hesitated, his eyes scanning Will from head to toe. The hoodie, the jeans, the sneakers, it all screamed casual in a place where casual wasn't welcome. He forced a tight smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have a dress code here." Will raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but curious. "Dress code," he repeated. "I wasn't aware. Is that a problem?" Kevin's smile didn't falter, but his tone grew firmer. "We like to maintain a certain standard for our guests," he said, carefully choosing his words. "Perhaps you'd feel more comfortable dining somewhere less formal." Will paused, taking in Kevin's words. His calm demeanor didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of understanding, maybe even disappointment. He glanced around the restaurant, his gaze lingering on the perfectly dressed diners enjoying their meals. "I see," Will said softly. He didn't argue or demand an explanation. Instead, he nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Thanks for letting me know." He turned to leave, his movements unhurried. To anyone watching, he might have seemed indifferent, even indifferent. But Kevin didn't notice the way a nearby waiter froze mid-step, his eyes widening in recognition. "Wait, isn't that," the waiter murmured under his breath, but Kevin didn't hear him. He was too busy congratulating himself on maintaining the restaurant's exclusivity. As far as Kevin was concerned, he had done his job. He had kept someone who didn't belong out of his pristine establishment. What Kevin didn't realize, however, was that this quiet man in a hoodie wasn't just anyone. And by the time he found out, it would already be too late. Unaware of the stir his actions would soon cause, Kevin returned to his post near the bar, where he could keep an eye on the restaurant. Meanwhile, Will exited the building, his hands still tucked into his pockets. He didn't look angry or upset, just thoughtful. He walked down the busy sidewalk, blending seamlessly into the crowd. Back inside, life at the Golden Spoon carried on as usual. Guests laughed over their meals, waiters weaved between tables, and Kevin continued his silent assessment of anyone who walked through the doors. He had no idea that the seemingly insignificant interaction with Will was about to turn his carefully curated world upside down. But for now, everything seemed normal. Kevin believed he had done the right thing, maintaining the restaurant's image. After all, the Golden Spoon wasn't just a restaurant, it was an experience, a symbol of prestige. And in Kevin's eyes, Will didn't fit that image. What Kevin didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly know, was that appearances could be deceiving. Sometimes, the most unassuming people held the most power. And sometimes, the smallest decisions had the biggest consequences. That night, as Kevin smoothed his tie and glanced around the restaurant with satisfaction, he had no way of knowing that his life was about to change forever. All because of the man in the hoodie, the man he had so quickly dismissed. As Will walked away from the Golden Spoon, the Los Angeles night buzzed around him. The streets were alive with activity, cars honking, pedestrians chatting, and the occasional street performer playing music for a small crowd. Will moved through it all like a shadow, blending effortlessly into the city's pulse. He didn't look back at the restaurant, nor did he let Kevin's dismissal weigh on his mind. For Will, it wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions about him based on his appearance, and it likely wouldn't be the last. He'd learned long ago how to handle situations like this with grace and patience. But for those who had recognized him, the moment lingered like a secret on the tip of their tongues. The waiter who had muttered something earlier was now frozen in place, his mind racing. "That was Will Smith," he whispered to one of his colleagues. "Who?" she asked, not bothering to look up as she arranged silverware on a nearby table. "You're kidding, right? Will Smith. The actor. The Will Smith." She paused, her hand hovering over a fork. "Wait, are you serious? The guy Kevin just..." The waiter nodded, his face pale. "Yeah. That guy Kevin just turned away." The two of them exchanged glances, the weight of the situation sinking in. Kevin, blissfully unaware, continued his patrol of the dining room, oblivious to the murmurs starting to ripple through the staff. The Golden Spoon wasn't just a restaurant, it was a status symbol. Nestled in the heart of Los Angeles, it was where celebrities, CEOs, and socialites came to see and be seen. The decor was sleek and modern, with gold accents that gleamed under the soft lighting. Every detail, from the custom-made chandeliers to the hand-carved chairs, was designed to exude luxury. Kevin had worked hard to climb the ranks and become the manager of such an establishment. To him, the Golden Spoon wasn't just a job, it was his kingdom. He saw himself as the gatekeeper of its prestige, the one who decided who was worthy of its ambience. He had rules, unwritten but firmly held. Guests should look the part, dressed to impress, oozing wealth and sophistication. Anything less was, in Kevin's eyes, unacceptable. And Will, with his casual hoodie and sneakers, had broken those rules. To Kevin, it didn't matter who Will was. In that moment, he had judged him purely on his appearance, deciding that he wasn't fit for a place like the Golden Spoon. As Kevin moved through the dining room, nodding politely at guests and ensuring everything was running smoothly, he couldn't shake a small sense of satisfaction. He believed he had done the right thing, protecting the restaurant's image. Meanwhile, outside the restaurant, Will continued his walk, his mind drifting to other things. He wasn't one to dwell on negativity. Life was too short, and he had learned over the years how to let moments like these roll off his back. Still, as he turned a corner and made his way toward a quieter street, a part of him couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. It wasn't anger he felt, more like a quiet disappointment. He thought about the people he'd met throughout his life, from all walks of life. The ones who judged him by his appearance, and the ones who saw beyond it. He thought about the countless times he'd been underestimated, even after all his years in the spotlight. Will wasn't bitter, though. If anything, Moments like these served as reminders of how important it was to treat everyone with kindness and respect. You never knew someone's story, and you certainly couldn't judge their worth based on what they wore or how they looked. The staff at the Golden Spoon were beginning to buzz with nervous energy. The realization of who Kevin had just dismissed was spreading like wildfire. Whispers floated from the kitchen to the bar, from the waitstaff to the host's stand. "Do you think he knows?" one server asked, glancing nervously at Kevin. "Of course not," another replied. "If he did, he wouldn't be so calm right now." At the bar, the head bartender shook his head in disbelief. "I can't believe it. Will Smith? Here." And Kevin just sent him away. A few staff members exchanged worried looks. They all knew Kevin's reputation for being harsh and judgmental, but this was something else entirely. "Do we tell him?" someone whispered. "No way," another replied. "Are you kidding? He'd lose it. Besides, it's not like we can undo what just happened." The tension among the staff was palpable, but Kevin remained oblivious. To him, everything was running smoothly. The guests were happy, the food was excellent, and the atmosphere was as refined as ever. Back at one of the corner tables, a man in a tailored suit leaned toward his wife, his brow furrowed in thought. "Did you see that guy who just walked out?" he asked quietly. She glanced up from her plate, her expression curious. "What guy?" "The one in the hoodie. I swear he looked familiar." "I think it was," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Never mind. It's probably nothing." But it wasn't nothing. The man couldn't shake the feeling that he had just seen someone important. He glanced toward the door, as if expecting the man to walk back in. As the evening progressed, Kevin continued his rounds, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. He took pride in his ability to keep everything under control, to maintain the pristine reputation of the Golden Spoon. To Kevin, image was everything. He believed that the restaurant's success depended on its exclusivity, on its ability to attract the right kind of people. And in his mind, Will wasn't the right kind. What Kevin didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly know, was that his decision to turn Will away would soon have consequences far beyond his imagination. Will eventually found a small diner tucked away on a quiet street. It wasn't fancy, just a simple, unassuming place with a neon sign that flickered slightly. But it was warm and welcoming, and that was all Will needed. He stepped inside and was greeted by a friendly waitress who smiled and led him to a booth near the window. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and grilled burgers filled the air, and the atmosphere was relaxed and unpretentious. As Will settled into his seat and looked over the menu, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. It wasn't the glitz and glamour of the Golden Spoon, but it didn't need to be. Here, he felt like he could just be himself, no judgments, no assumptions. The waitress returned with a steaming cup of coffee and a cheerful, "Take your time, hon." Will smiled, thanked her, and leaned back in his seat. As he sipped his coffee, he thought about the events of the evening. He didn't hold any resentment toward Kevin or the Golden Spoon. If anything, he felt a sense of pity. Kevin's actions had said more about him than they did about Will. And in the end, Will knew that life had a way of teaching its own lessons. Kevin wasn't known for his tact. In fact, among the staff of the Golden Spoon, his sharp tongue and judgmental attitude were infamous. He prided himself on running what he often referred to as a prestigious establishment, where every detail from the polished silverware to the high-profile clientele reflected a level of exclusivity he was determined to maintain. The restaurant was Kevin's domain, and he ran it with an iron fist. To him, the Golden Spoon was not just a place to dine, it was a symbol of status. And Kevin took it upon himself to ensure that this status was upheld at all times. For him, that meant scrutinizing every person who walked through the doors. Not everyone deserved to sit at the tables lined with crisp white tablecloths or to savor the culinary masterpieces served on fine china. When Will entered, dressed in his casual hoodie and sneakers, Kevin's instincts kicked in immediately. His eyes narrowed as he took in the man's relaxed attire, his lack of pretense, and the absence of any outward signs of wealth or importance. To Kevin, Will was an anomaly, a disruption to the carefully curated image of the restaurant. Kevin strode over with purpose, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. His posture was rigid, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He stopped just a few feet away from Will, his expression neutral but his eyes betraying his disapproval. "Good evening," Kevin said, his voice smooth but laced with condescension. "How can I help you?" Will offered a polite smile. "I'd like a table for one, please." Kevin didn't move. Instead, he let his gaze drop to Will's sneakers, then slowly scanned up to his hoodie. The unspoken message in his stare was clear: "You don't belong here." "I'm sorry, sir," Kevin began, his tone carefully measured, "but we have a dress code here." Will's smile faltered slightly, though his calm demeanor remained intact. "Dress code?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Yes," Kevin replied, his tone growing firmer. He gestured vaguely toward Will's sneakers, as if their mere presence offended him. "We like to maintain a certain standard for our guests. Perhaps you'd feel more comfortable dining somewhere less formal." Will tilted his head slightly, studying Kevin with quiet curiosity. He didn't miss the way Kevin's eyes seemed to harden with each passing second. "I just want to grab a bite and leave," Will said calmly, his tone devoid of irritation. But Kevin wasn't swayed. If anything, Will's relaxed response only seemed to irritate him further. He chuckled softly, the sound low and dismissive, like he was laughing at a joke only he understood. "I'm afraid that's not how it works here," he said, gesturing toward the elegantly dressed patrons scattered across the dining room. Will glanced around, taking in the scene. Men in tailored suits and women in designer dresses sat at tables, sipping wine and enjoying gourmet meals. The restaurant exuded opulence, every detail designed to impress. It was clear that Kevin had built his identity around being the gatekeeper of this world. "Look," Will said, keeping his tone even, "I'm not here to make a scene or cause any trouble. I just want to eat and be on my way." But Kevin wasn't interested in explanations. To him, Will's presence was an affront to the restaurant's image, and he wasn't about to let it slide. He shook his head, his lips curving into a tight, forced smile. "I'm sure you understand," he said, his voice dripping with insincerity. "This establishment caters to a specific clientele. It's nothing personal, of course." Will held Kevin's gaze for a moment, his expression unreadable. There was no anger in his eyes, no visible frustration. Instead, there was a calmness, a quiet strength that seemed to unsettle Kevin more than any argument could have. "I see," Will said simply, his voice steady. He nodded once, as if accepting Kevin's decision, and turned to leave. Kevin watched him go, a sense of satisfaction settling over him. He believed he had done the right thing, protecting the restaurant's image and maintaining its exclusivity. To Kevin, this was just another moment in his daily routine, another instance of upholding the standards he so fiercely believed in. But for the staff, the scene they had just witnessed was anything but ordinary. From behind the bar, a waiter leaned toward his co-worker, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see that?" he asked, his eyes wide. "See what?" the other waiter replied, glancing toward the door where Will had just exited. "That guy." Kevin turned away, the first waiter said. "I'm pretty sure that was Will Smith." The second waiter froze, his tray of glasses rattling slightly in his hands. "You're joking," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I'm not," the first waiter insisted. "I swear, it was him. He didn't make a big deal about it, but I'm telling you, that was him." The two waiters exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the moment sinking in. Meanwhile, at the hostess stand, Another employee shook her head in disbelief. "Do you think Kevin even knows who he just turned away?" she asked. "Not a chance," her colleague replied. "He probably didn't even recognize him. He was too busy judging his sneakers." Back in the dining room, Kevin returned to his usual routine, moving from table to table with a practiced smile. He had already put the interaction with Will out of his mind, convinced that he had handled the situation perfectly. To him, it was just another example of his ability to maintain the restaurant's standards. He didn't notice the way the staff exchanged nervous glances as he passed by. He didn't hear the whispers spreading through the kitchen or the murmurs at the bar. Kevin was too focused on the polished surface of his restaurant, too consumed by his role as its self-appointed gatekeeper. As he walked past a table near the window, one of the diners leaned toward her companion and spoke in hushed tones. "Did you see that man who walked out earlier?" she asked. "The one in the hoodie," her companion replied. "Yes," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "I could have sworn he looked familiar. Do you think he was someone important?" Her companion shrugged, taking a sip of his wine. "If he was, I'm sure Kevin would have recognized him," he said confidently. "He doesn't miss anything." But Kevin had missed something big. And as the evening went on, the weight of that oversight began to ripple through the staff, each of them wondering how long it would be before Kevin realized the truth. Outside, Will continued his walk, the city's energy buzzing around him. He didn't dwell on the interaction with Kevin. It wasn't the first time he had been underestimated, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Still, as he turned a corner and made his way down a quieter street, he couldn't help but reflect on the moment. It wasn't anger he felt, more like a quiet disappointment. He thought about how often people made assumptions based on appearances, how quick they were to judge without taking the time to understand. Will knew who he was. He didn't need a fancy suit or an entourage to prove his worth. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, a strength that came from years of navigating a world that often judged him unfairly. And while Kevin might have dismissed him as unimportant, Will knew the truth. He knew that respect wasn't something you earned by dressing the part or fitting into someone else's idea of success. It was something you earned by staying true to yourself, even in the face of prejudice. Would you like me to continue this section even further, diving deeper into Kevin's self-righteous behavior or exploring Will's reflections more? As Will strolled away from the restaurant, the night air carried a sense of calm that belied the tension brewing inside the Golden Spoon. The glow of city lights reflected in the glossy windows, but none of it registered in Kevin's mind. Inside, he was still busy congratulating himself for his decisiveness, replaying the scene in his head with an inflated sense of pride. Kevin had always seen himself as more than just a manager, he was a guardian of prestige, the face of exclusivity. To him, every guest who walked through the door was a piece of the puzzle that made up the restaurant's elite image. He was blind to the possibility that, in his arrogance, he might have judged a situation wrong or, worse yet, offended someone who could have done more for his establishment than he could ever imagine. The whispers behind the scenes began to grow louder. In the kitchen, the sous chef paused mid-chop, staring at the waitstaff who gathered near the doorway, whispering among themselves. "What's going on out there?" the chef asked, setting down his knife. One of the servers hesitated before speaking. "Kevin just turned away someone really important, I think." The chef frowned. "Important? Who?" "Will Smith," the server said quietly, almost as if saying the name too loudly might make it more real. The chef's eyes widened. "You're kidding," he said, the disbelief evident in his voice. "Will Smith? The Will Smith?" The server nodded nervously. "Yeah. Hoodie, sneakers, low-key. I recognized him as soon as he walked in, but Kevin," the server trailed off, gesturing toward the dining room where Kevin was still making his rounds. The chef wiped his hands on his apron, his expression a mix of shock and concern. "If that's true, Kevin's just made the mistake of a lifetime, he muttered. At one of the prime tables near the center of the dining room, a well-dressed couple was deep in conversation. The man, a real estate tycoon known for his sharp instincts, leaned toward his wife, lowering his voice. "That guy who walked out earlier," he said. "Did you get a good look at him?" His wife shook her head, her diamond earrings catching the light. "No, why?" "I think it was someone famous," the man replied, his brow furrowed. "He looked familiar." "Like?" "I don't know, someone I've seen on TV or in movies." His wife raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "If that's the case, why would he leave?" The man glanced around, his gaze landing on Kevin, who was chatting with another table. "Maybe he wasn't happy with something. Or maybe," he added, lowering his voice even further, "Kevin turned him away. You know how he can be." His wife frowned, glancing toward the entrance. "If Kevin turned away someone important, that's not going to end well," she said. The man nodded. "No, it won't. Not if it gets out." While the staff and some guests began to piece together what had just happened, Kevin remained completely oblivious. To him, the night was running smoothly. The tables were full, the food was being served on time, and the guests were enjoying themselves. He had no idea that his decision to turn away Will Smith was the topic of conversation in nearly every corner of the restaurant. Kevin's confidence bordered on arrogance as he moved through the dining room, stopping to chat with a table of regulars. He laughed at their jokes, complimented their choice of wine, and assured them that dessert was on the way. He was in his element, basking in the glow of the restaurant's success. But as he turned to head back toward the bar, he noticed a group of staff members huddled near the kitchen entrance, their faces tense. Kevin's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly dismissed the thought. They were probably just dealing with a minor issue, nothing he needed to concern himself with. Will, meanwhile, had found a quiet bench a few blocks away, where he could sit and gather his thoughts. The city buzzed around him, but he was lost in his own world, replaying the interaction with Kevin in his mind. It wasn't anger that filled him, he had long since learned to let go of resentment in situations like this. Instead, he felt a sense of sadness, a quiet disappointment in how quick people were to judge others based on appearances. Will pulled out his phone, scrolling through his messages and emails. He had a busy day ahead tomorrow, filled with meetings and events, but for now, he just wanted to enjoy a moment of peace. He thought about the countless times he had been underestimated throughout his life. Even now, as one of the most recognizable names in Hollywood, he still encountered moments like this, moments where someone saw only what was on the surface and made their judgments without looking deeper. But Will wasn't bitter. He had come to understand that these moments were opportunities to remind himself of his values, to reaffirm his belief in treating everyone with kindness and respect. Back at the Golden Spoon, the staff's whispers had turned into quiet conversations, each person trying to make sense of what had just happened. The servers exchanged uneasy glances, the bartenders shook their heads in disbelief, and even the chefs in the kitchen were talking about it. "Do you think Kevin knows?" one of the servers asked. "Not a chance," another replied. "He's too full of himself to realize." The head bartender frowned, leaning against the counter. "This is bad," he said. "Really bad. If word gets out that Kevin turned away Will Smith, it's going to make us look terrible." "What do we do?" a younger server asked, her voice filled with worry. The bartender sighed, shaking his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we can't fix it. Kevin's the one who made the call, and Kevin's the one who's going to have to deal with the fallout." As the evening wore on, Kevin began to notice a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The staff seemed more tense than usual, their movements hurried and their conversations hushed. Even some of the guests seemed distracted, their eyes flicking toward the entrance or whispering among themselves. Kevin's brow furrowed as he approached the hostess stand. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone sharp. The hostess hesitated, her eyes darting toward the kitchen. "Nothing, sir," she said quickly, her voice tight. Kevin narrowed his eyes. He didn't believe her, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he turned and walked toward the bar, where a small group of servers had gathered. As he approached, the group quickly dispersed, each person finding an excuse to leave. Kevin's irritation grew. He didn't like being out of the loop, and it was clear that something was going on behind the scenes. Will nodded slowly, his calm demeanor masking the complexity of his thoughts. "All right," he said softly, his voice steady, "if that's the rule." He turned without further protest, his movements deliberate yet unhurried. To an observer, it might have seemed like a man accepting defeat. But Will wasn't one to dwell on moments like this. He had learned to let others' actions speak louder than their intentions. As he exited through the grand double doors of the Golden Spoon, the subtle murmur of conversation followed him. In one corner, a couple seated by the window exchanged startled glances, their whispers barely audible over the clinking of glasses. "Wait," the man said, leaning closer to his wife. "Isn't that Will Smith?" His wife's eyes widened as she glanced toward the door. "You think so?" "I mean, it could be," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "He was dressed so casually. But, yes, now that you mention it, it did look like him." The man nodded, his brow furrowing. "I'm sure of it. I saw him in that interview last week, same look, same vibe. How did I not notice earlier?" They both turned their attention to Kevin, who was busy directing a server toward another table, utterly oblivious to the stir he had just caused. Back in the kitchen, the whispers among the staff were growing louder. The head bartender leaned against the counter, arms crossed as he listened to the murmur of speculation from a nearby server. "So you're saying Kevin just turned away Will Smith?" the bartender asked, his tone skeptical but curious. "I swear it was him," the server insisted, her face pale with nervous energy. "I've seen his movies, his interviews, there's no way I'm wrong." The bartender shook his head, letting out a low whistle. "If that's true, Kevin's in for a wake-up call. You can't just turn someone like that away and think there won't be consequences." Meanwhile, in the dining room, more guests were starting to notice the growing tension among the staff. A man seated at a table near the bar raised an eyebrow as he watched two servers hurriedly whispering behind the hostess stand. "What's going on over there?" he asked his dining companion. The woman shrugged, her attention drifting toward the entrance. "I don't know," she said. "But something's definitely up. Did you see the guy who left earlier? I think he was someone important." Kevin, however, was still blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. As he made his rounds through the dining room, he noticed the occasional glance or hushed whisper, but he dismissed it as nothing more than idle chatter. When he passed by the bar, he paused to speak with one of the senior servers. "Everything running smoothly?" he asked, his tone brisk. The server hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, sir," she said quickly. But Kevin didn't miss the way her eyes flicked toward the entrance, or the slight tension in her voice. He frowned, his confidence wavering slightly. "Good," he said curtly, before moving on. But as he continued his rounds, a nagging feeling began to creep into his mind. Something felt off, like a shift in the atmosphere that he couldn't quite pinpoint. At a table near the center of the room, an older gentleman with salt and pepper hair leaned toward his dining companion, lowering his voice. "Do you know who that was?" he asked, nodding subtly toward the door where Will had exited moments earlier. The woman across from him raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "Will Smith," he said, his tone confident. "I'd recognize him anywhere." The woman's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "That was him." The man nodded. "No doubt about it. I've seen him in person before, same look, same energy." And Kevin turned him away like he was some random guy off the street. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line as she glanced toward Kevin, who was now speaking with another table. Does he even realize what he's done? Outside the restaurant, Will stood on the sidewalk for a moment, pulling out his phone. He wasn't one to make a scene, but he also wasn't one to let moments like this pass without reflection. Scrolling through his contacts, he paused on a name someone who had once told him, "If you ever need anything, just let me know." It wasn't a threat or a move for revenge, but a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes, life had a way of bringing balance. Will sent a brief message, his words simple but meaningful. Then he tucked his phone back into his pocket and began to walk down the street, his stride calm and unhurried. Back inside the Golden Spoon, the phone at the hostess stand rang sharply, cutting through the hum of conversation. The hostess picked it up, her voice cheerful but professional. "Good evening, the Golden Spoon. How can I assist you?" The voice on the other end was calm but carried an unmistakable authority. "This is Michael Harper," the man said, his tone clipped. The hostess's eyes widened. Michael Harper was one of the city's most influential restaurateurs, a man whose name carried weight in every corner of the culinary world. "Yes, Mr. Harper," she said quickly. "How can I help you?" "There's something I need to discuss with your manager." "Put him on the line." The hostess hesitated for a moment, her gaze darting toward Kevin, who was now standing near the kitchen entrance. "Of course, sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Please hold." She placed the phone on the counter and hurried toward Kevin, her steps quick and purposeful. "Kevin," she said, her voice urgent. He turned to her, frowning. "What is it?" "There's a call for you," she said. "It's Michael Harper." Kevin's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly composed himself. "Harper? What does he want?" "I don't know," the hostess admitted, her voice hushed. "But he sounds serious." Kevin straightened his tie, his confidence returning. "All right," he said, brushing past her. "I'll handle it." As Kevin picked up the phone, his voice was calm and self-assured. "This is Kevin, the manager. How can I assist you, Mr. Harper?" On the other end, Michael Harper's tone was measured but firm. "Kevin, I just received a very interesting message about an incident at your restaurant tonight. Can you explain why one of your staff members turned away a guest based on their appearance?" Kevin blinked, caught off guard. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," he said, though his mind immediately flashed to his interaction with Will. "You turned away Will Smith," Harper said bluntly, his voice sharp. Kevin felt his stomach drop. "Will Smith," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Harper said. "One of the most well-known figures in the world, and you dismissed him as if he didn't matter. Do you have any idea how bad this makes your establishment look?" Kevin opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time that evening, he was completely speechless. Kevin's grip tightened on the phone as Michael Harper's words echoed in his ears. "Will Smith? The Will Smith," he stammered, struggling to keep his composure. "Yes," Harper replied, his tone unwavering. "And the message I received was very clear, you turned him away because of some so-called dress code." He let the words hang in the air for a moment, his silence more damning than any accusation. Kevin's heart raced. "Mr. Harper, I didn't realize." "That's exactly the problem," Harper interrupted, his voice icy. "You didn't realize. You were so concerned with appearances and your own misguided sense of prestige that you dismissed someone without understanding who they were or what they could mean for your restaurant." Kevin swallowed hard, his mind scrambling for an explanation, an excuse, anything to justify his actions. "It wasn't personal," he said weakly. "We just have rules," and Harper cut him off again. Let me be perfectly clear, Kevin. Your rules just cost you more than you can imagine. Do you have any idea how quickly word spreads in this industry? One misstep like this, and your reputation could be ruined overnight. As the call ended, Kevin placed the phone back on the counter with trembling hands. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each more frantic than the last. He replayed the interaction with Will in his head, his chest tightening as he realized how dismissive he had been. How could he have been so blind? He glanced around the dining room, suddenly hyper-aware of the guests who were still murmuring among themselves. Were they talking about him? Did they know what had happened? The staff avoided his gaze as he made his way toward the kitchen, his usually confident stride replaced by an uneasy shuffle. He needed to think, to regroup, but the weight of his mistake was pressing down on him like a leaden cloak. Meanwhile, Will had made his way to a quiet cafe down the street. The ambience was far less polished than the Golden Spoon, but the staff greeted him with warm smiles and genuine kindness. He ordered a simple meal and settled into a corner booth, his mind calm despite the events of the evening. As he ate, his phone buzzed softly on the table. Picking it up, he saw a reply to the message he had sent earlier. Handled. They'll feel this one. Will smiled faintly, setting the phone back down. He wasn't one for revenge. This wasn't about teaching Kevin a personal lesson. It was about principles, about holding people accountable for how they treated others. He leaned back in his seat, savoring the quiet satisfaction of knowing that change was already in motion. Back at the Golden Spoon, the tension among the staff was palpable. The servers exchanged uneasy glances, their usual chatter replaced by hushed whispers. "Did you see Kevin after that phone call?" one of them asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," another replied. "He looked like he'd seen a ghost." "What do you think Harper said to him?" "Probably tore him apart," the first server said with a grim smile. "Honestly, he deserves it. Turning away someone like Will Smith? That's just dumb." The head bartender leaned in, his expression serious. "It's not just dumb, it's career suicide. Word gets out about this, and the Golden Spoon's reputation is toast." One of the younger servers hesitated before speaking. "Do you think we'll lose our jobs if this blows up?" The bartender shook his head. "Doubtful. It's Kevin who's on the chopping block. He made the call, and he'll be the one to answer for it." As the evening wore on, the guests at the Golden Spoon began to trickle out earlier than usual. Some left quietly, their expressions thoughtful as they glanced toward the entrance. Others murmured among themselves, their voices tinged with curiosity and disbelief. At one table, a group of professionals finished their drinks and stood to leave. "I can't believe it," one of them said as they walked toward the exit. "Will Smith turned away like that. What was Kevin thinking?" "Probably wasn't thinking at all," another replied with a shrug. "But if Harper's involved now, this place is in trouble." The group exited into the night, their conversation fading into the distance. Inside, the restaurant felt emptier, the usual buzz of activity replaced by an uneasy quiet. In his office, Kevin sat with his head in his hands, the weight of the evening finally sinking in. He had built his career on maintaining an air of exclusivity, on curating an image of perfection. But tonight, that image had shattered. He glanced at his computer screen, where the restaurant's email inbox was already filling with messages. Some were from staff members expressing their concerns, while others were from guests who had been present that evening, questioning his decision to turn Will Smith away. Kevin's phone buzzed on the desk, and he picked it up hesitantly. It was a message from one of his colleagues at another high-profile restaurant. "Heard what happened? You'd better brace yourself, this is going to get ugly." Kevin's stomach churned as he set the phone down. He knew his colleague was right. This wasn't something he could sweep under the rug. Outside the restaurant, the night was calm, the chaos inside the Golden Spoon a stark contrast to the peaceful streets. Will finished his meal at the cafe, leaving a generous tip for the staff before stepping back out into the cool evening air. As he walked down the street, he passed by the Golden Spoon once more. He paused for a moment, glancing through the large windows. Inside, he could see Kevin pacing near the bar, his expression a mix of frustration and fear. Will's gaze softened, but he didn't linger. He continued on his way, his footsteps steady and purposeful. For Will, the night wasn't about proving a point to Kevin or seeking retribution. It was about something bigger, about challenging the assumptions and prejudices that still lingered in places like the Golden Spoon. And while Kevin might not have realized it yet, the lesson was already taking root. Kevin barely slept that night. The weight of Michael Harper's call had gnawed at him, but he convinced himself that it might blow over. After all, no official complaints had come in, and as far as he knew, Will Smith hadn't made any public statements about the incident. It was just a misunderstanding, Kevin told himself. Things will go back to normal. But the moment Kevin stepped out of his car the next morning, he knew normal was far out of reach. A small crowd had gathered outside the Golden Spoon. Reporters with cameras and microphones jostled for position, their voices cutting through the crisp morning air. Kevin. Is it true you turned Will Smith away? Do you have any comment on the backlash? What do you have to say to the people calling for your resignation? Kevin froze, his stomach knotting as he stared at the throng of reporters. The questions blurred together into a cacophony of noise. He pushed past them, his head down, muttering, "No comment," as camera flashes lit up the entrance. Inside the restaurant, the scene was no less chaotic. Staff members huddled in small groups, their faces pale with worry. The phones at the hostess stand rang incessantly, and Kevin's assistant rushed up to him the moment he entered. "Kevin," she said, her voice frantic. "You need to see this." She handed him her tablet, the screen already lit up with a glaring headline. Hollywood superstar Will Smith snubbed by manager at the Golden Spoon. Kevin's heart sank as he scanned the article. It detailed the entire encounter from the previous night, complete with quotes from diners who had witnessed it firsthand. One guest was quoted as saying, "It was shocking to see how dismissive the manager was. Will Smith was so polite, but the manager treated him like he wasn't even worth his time." Another added, "It was clear the manager judged him based on his casual attire. But come on, it's Will Smith. How could anyone not recognize him?" The article went on to note that while Will himself hadn't spoken to the press, a diner had posted about the incident on social media, complete with a grainy photo of Will leaving the restaurant. The post had gone viral overnight, sparking outrage and widespread condemnation. The comments section was flooded with backlash. "Unacceptable behavior. I'm never eating there again. Judging someone based on their appearance. Disgusting. They deserve all the backlash they're getting. Will Smith is a legend, and this is how he's treated. Shame on the Golden Spoon." Kevin's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen to see dozens of missed calls and text messages, most of them from numbers he didn't recognize. By midday, the story had been picked up by nearly every major news outlet. Television anchors discussed it with a mix of disbelief and outrage, and social media was ablaze with hashtags like #GoldenSpoonScandal and #RespectWillSmith. Celebrities began weighing in as well. A prominent actor tweeted, "Will Smith has always been one of the kindest and most humble people I know. The way he was treated is appalling. Do better, Golden Spoon." The restaurant's official social media accounts were inundated with angry comments and negative reviews. A once perfect 5-star rating on review sites plummeted to 2 stars within hours, with new reviews calling the restaurant pretentious and unwelcoming. Kevin tried to focus on damage control, but every attempt seemed to make things worse. When the restaurant issued a brief statement claiming the incident was a misunderstanding, it only fueled more outrage. "A misunderstanding?" one commenter wrote. You judged a man based on his clothes. That's not a misunderstanding, it's snobbery. By the afternoon, Kevin received a call he had been dreading. It was Michael Harper again, and this time, his tone was even colder. "Kevin," Harper began, his voice dripping with disdain. "I warned you last night that this could blow up. You didn't take me seriously, and now look where we are." "Mr. Harper," Kevin started, but Harper cut him off. "Save it," he said sharply. "I just got off the phone with the restaurant's investors, and they're furious. Do you have any idea how much damage this has done to our brand? Not just the Golden Spoon, but every restaurant in our portfolio is being dragged through the mud because of your arrogance." "I can fix this," Kevin said desperately. "I'll issue a public apology." "You're done, Kevin," Harper interrupted. "Pack up your things. Effective immediately, you're no longer employed here." The line went dead, leaving Kevin staring at his phone in stunned silence. While Kevin's career crumbled, Will's day was far more serene. He spent the morning at a local park, enjoying the fresh air and the sound of birdsong. He hadn't spoken to the press or issued any statements he didn't need to. The public had taken up his cause, their voices louder and more unified than anything he could have said himself. The incident had sparked a larger conversation about judgment, prejudice, and the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their appearance. As Will sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed with a message from Michael Harper. "Consider the issue resolved. My apologies for how you were treated. If there's anything we can do to make it right, let me know." Will smiled faintly as he typed a short reply. "No need. Just treat the next guy better." By the end of the week, the Golden Spoon was unrecognizable. The once crowded dining room was nearly empty, and reservations had plummeted. Word spread that Kevin had been fired, but it did little to stem the tide of criticism. The restaurant's owners scrambled to repair the damage, offering discounts and donations to charity, but the public wasn't easily appeased. The incident had left a permanent stain on the restaurant's reputation, a reminder of how quickly arrogance could lead to downfall. As for Kevin, he disappeared from the culinary scene entirely. His name became synonymous with poor judgment, a cautionary tale for other managers in the industry. Months later, Will was seated at another restaurant, this time with friends. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, the staff attentive without being overbearing. As he laughed and chatted with his companions, the manager approached their table, his expression nervous but earnest. "Mr. Smith," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to say it's an honor to have you here. Please let me know if there's anything we can do to make your experience perfect." Will looked up, his smile kind but knowing. "Just keep treating everyone like this," he said simply. The manager nodded, relief washing over his face. As the evening went on, Will couldn't help but reflect on the events at the Golden Spoon. He hadn't set out to make a statement, but the incident had become a powerful reminder: respect wasn't about appearances or status, it was about humanity. And for Will, that was a lesson worth sharing. The fallout for the Golden Spoon wasn't just a momentary blip, it was a tidal wave. Within days, Kevin's actions became a trending topic on social media, not just because it involved Will Smith, but because it struck a deeper chord with the public. People began sharing their own experiences of being judged unfairly based on appearance, using the hashtag Golden Spoon lesson. Meanwhile, Kevin's firing became public knowledge after an internal memo was leaked. News outlets jumped on it, framing it as the inevitable consequence of arrogance and poor judgment. Headlines like "Prestigious Restaurant Manager Fired After Humiliating Hollywood Star" flooded the internet. Despite the PR team's best efforts, the Golden Spoon couldn't shake the stigma. Protesters began gathering outside the restaurant, holding signs that read "Respect is for everyone and not just for the wealthy-looking." The sight of cameras rolling and people chanting was a stark contrast to the restaurant's once exclusive facade. The incident also caught the attention of advocacy groups that championed fairness and inclusion in the workplace. Several well-known organizations issued statements condemning the behavior Kevin displayed, pointing out that it reflected a broader issue in the hospitality industry. One activist wrote in an op-ed, "What happened to Will Smith at the Golden Spoon is not an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a culture that values appearances over people. This isn't just about one man, it's about changing the way we see and treat others." The article gained traction, sparking debates on news panels and social media. While the Golden Spoon was the center of attention, the conversation shifted to a larger narrative about humility, respect, and the importance of never judging someone at face value. Inside the Golden Spoon, the once pristine ambience was now tainted with unease. Servers whispered among themselves, wondering if they should start looking for new jobs. Regular diners canceled their reservations, and new walk-ins were few and far between. One evening, just days after Kevin's dismissal, a prominent food critic visited the restaurant, unannounced. The staff did their best to maintain professionalism, but the tension was palpable. The critic later published an article that painted a grim picture. The Golden Spoon may have prided itself on exclusivity, but the only thing exclusive now is the emptiness of its dining room. A restaurant that forgets the importance of respect and humility will find itself without guests no matter how good the food might be. The review went viral, and its words became a symbolic epitaph for what the Golden Spoon once represented. While the Golden Spoon struggled to recover, Kevin faced his own personal reckoning. His name became a symbol of elitism and poor leadership. Job offers evaporated before they could even materialize, and colleagues in the industry distanced themselves from him. One day, Kevin decided to try reaching out to Will himself. He found an email address through a mutual connection and composed a lengthy apology. "Dear Mr. Smith, I want to sincerely apologize for the way I treated you that evening. My actions were inexcusable, and I deeply regret the way I handled the situation. It was a moment of poor judgment that has cost me more than I can express. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." He hesitated before sending the email, unsure if it would ever even reach Will. And even if it did, would it make a difference? The email was met with silence. While Kevin grappled with the fallout, Will quietly continued his routine, largely avoiding the spotlight. He hadn't sought to punish the Golden Spoon or Kevin, the public response had simply unfolded on its own. But behind the scenes, Will was making moves. He connected with the advocacy groups that had used the incident to shed light on larger societal issues, offering to support their efforts. He also spoke privately with Michael Harper, encouraging him to implement policies across his restaurants that prioritized respect and fair treatment of all guests, regardless of appearance. Harper took the suggestion seriously. Within weeks, his entire portfolio of restaurants adopted new training programs for their staff, emphasizing inclusion and hospitality. Harper even issued a public statement, acknowledging the lessons learned from the incident. "This experience has taught us the importance of humility and respect in the service industry. We are committed to ensuring that every guest feels welcome in our establishments, regardless of how they dress or who they are. We owe it to our patrons and ourselves to do better." Months later, the ripple effects of Will's quiet influence were still being felt. Restaurants across the city began revisiting their policies, some even eliminating dress codes entirely. A local paper ran a feature titled, "The Golden Spoon Scandal: How One Man's Humility Changed the Hospitality Industry." The piece praised Will for his refusal to lash out publicly, noting how his silence had allowed the public and the industry to reflect on their behavior. "Will Smith didn't demand justice or revenge," the article read. "He simply let the truth speak for itself, and in doing so, he reminded us all of the power of dignity." As for Kevin, life had taken a sharp downturn. Unable to find work in the restaurant industry, he took a job managing a small diner on the outskirts of the city. It was a far cry from the glitz and glamour of the Golden Spoon, but it was humbling work. One evening, As Kevin cleared tables after a busy shift, a familiar face walked in. It was Will Smith, casually dressed and smiling warmly. Kevin froze, unsure of what to do. Will approached the counter and greeted him. "Hey, Kevin," he said, his tone friendly. "How's it going?" Kevin stammered, caught off guard. "I. I'm fine, Mr. Smith. What brings you here?" Will shrugged. "Just wanted to grab a bite. I heard the burgers here are pretty good." Kevin nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he handed Will a menu. "They are. Let me know if you need anything." As Will sat down and began to eat, Kevin couldn't help but reflect on how far he had fallen and how gracious Will was being despite everything that had happened. It was a moment of clarity, a reminder that respect and kindness could change everything. That night, as Will left the diner, Kevin stopped him at the door. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" Will asked, genuinely curious. "For teaching me a lesson I should have learned a long time ago," Kevin replied. Will smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. "It's never too late to start doing better," he said simply before walking into the night. And with that, Kevin resolved to rebuild not just his career, but himself. The days after the incident were a whirlwind of consequences for the Golden Spoon. The once glamorous restaurant, known for its exclusive clientele and high-end dining experience, was now facing the harsh reality of public backlash. As Kevin's mistake became a national talking point, the ripple effect spread far beyond what he could have ever anticipated. By the end of the week, the restaurant had become a ghost town. The tables, which had once been reserved months in advance, now sat empty, collecting dust. The kitchen, once humming with the rush of orders, now felt eerily silent. Even the staff, who had been loyal to Kevin, found themselves unsure of how to continue in a place that had lost its credibility. Regular customers, once so eager to secure a spot at the Golden Spoon, now vowed to never return, their trust shattered by the manager's public display of arrogance. The decision to shut down the Golden Spoon was inevitable. The ownership, under pressure from investors and the public, had no choice but to pull the plug. Despite the restaurant's pristine reputation over the years, the damage done to its name was irreparable. It wasn't just a few disgruntled customers, this was a collective outcry from people who felt humiliated and unheard. As for Kevin, the man who had once prided himself on being in control, the fall was swift and unforgiving. His pride had made him blind to the consequences of his actions, and now it was his turn to face them. After being fired from the Golden Spoon, Kevin struggled to regain his footing. His reputation, once built on the back of a high-status position, was now tarnished beyond repair. The calls that once came from potential clients and restaurant owners eager to partner with him ceased to exist. Kevin found himself isolated. No one wanted to be associated with someone who had so clearly shown a lack of respect and humility. For a time, Kevin tried to salvage his career, reaching out to old colleagues and trying to explain himself. But the response was always the same: silence. There was no room for excuses when his actions had been so publicly disgraceful. Kevin's name became synonymous with arrogance, and no amount of apologies could undo the damage. One afternoon, after weeks of silence and rejection, Kevin found himself sitting alone in his small apartment, staring at a closed laptop. The weight of his decisions, the disrespect he had shown to someone as influential as Will Smith, began to sink in. He knew it was his own pride that had led to his downfall. There was no one to blame but himself. Meanwhile, Will Smith moved through the world with the same calm dignity he had always carried, unaffected by the drama that had unfolded. He didn't seek to exploit Kevin's downfall for personal gain. He had never wanted revenge, he simply wanted to move on with his life, to keep doing the work he loved. 1 week after the incident at the Golden Spoon, Will was invited to a charity event in the city. It was a high-profile event, with many celebrities in attendance, but Will's presence was not just about his star power. The cause he was supporting, a charity aimed at providing education to underprivileged children, was what truly mattered to him. As he mingled with the other guests, a reporter approached him, the same reporter who had covered the Golden Spoon incident. The question came, almost expected, "Mr. Smith, after the incident at the Golden Spoon, do you have any comments?" Will smiled warmly, his eyes never leaving the reporter's face. He took a breath before speaking softly but confidently. "Everyone deserves kindness," he said. "Sometimes, it's just about showing up with an open heart." The simplicity of his words, the grace with which he spoke, struck a chord with those who were listening. In the world of media where sensationalism often ruled, Will's response was like a breath of fresh air. He didn't need to say more, and he didn't need to condemn anyone. His words were a lesson in empathy, humility, and strength. They were a reminder that kindness is often the most powerful tool we have. Will's comment quickly went viral, shared across social media platforms and news outlets. People were moved by his humility and his ability to rise above the situation. It wasn't just the fact that Will was a Hollywood superstar who had been disrespected, it was that he chose to respond with dignity, not anger. His words resonated deeply, and they became a rallying cry for those who had been made to feel less than because of their appearance or status. The message that Will shared was simple: kindness and respect for others, no matter who they are or what they look like, could transform lives. The reaction from the public was overwhelming. People began sharing their own stories of being judged unfairly, and many praised Will for leading by example. His actions showed them that responding with grace, rather than stooping to negativity, could help bridge the divides that often separate us. In the quiet aftermath of all the chaos, Kevin had the opportunity to reflect on his actions. He had been given a chance to learn, and yet he had ignored it. Will, on the other hand, had shown him a different way. One afternoon, after reading countless articles about Will's response, Kevin sat in front of his computer and began typing. He didn't know if it would help, but he needed to say something. "Dear Mr. Smith, I want to offer you my sincerest apologies for the way I treated you. Looking back, I realize how wrong I was, and I deeply regret my actions. I allowed my position and pride to blind me to what really matters: respect for others. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Kevin clicked send, not knowing whether he would ever hear back from Will. But the act of writing the letter was, in a way, his own form of redemption. He had acknowledged his mistake, and that was the first step toward becoming a better person. In the end, Will's response to the whole ordeal became something greater than just a moment in time. It became a lasting legacy, a reminder to the world that how we treat others is far more important than the labels or titles we wear. Will's grace was not just in his words, but in his actions, and it served as a model for how to deal with difficult situations with dignity. The Golden Spoon may have closed its doors, but the lessons learned from that night would live on. Kevin's arrogance was a cautionary tale, while Will's kindness would be remembered as a call to change the way we view and treat others. And for Will, the incident at the Golden Spoon was just another reminder of the power of compassion. He didn't need to be a hero, he just needed to be human. And sometimes, that was enough. As Will continued on his path, his quiet influence had already begun to change things. He wasn't trying to make a statement, he was simply being the person he knew he could be, someone who valued respect, humility, and kindness above all else. The world was watching, and slowly, it was changing for the better. In life, it's easy to judge people by their appearances. We all do it, whether it's the clothes someone wears, the car they drive, or the job they hold. Our world often places value on the external, on the visible markers of success, wealth, or status. But true greatness, as Kevin learned too late, isn't always wrapped in glamour. Sometimes, it walks in quietly, giving us a chance to show who we really are. And when we fail, The consequences can echo louder than we ever imagined. We live in a society that loves to draw lines. Lines between rich and poor. Lines between the powerful and the powerless. Lines between the famous and the unknown. It's almost as if we're trained to create categories, to divide people into groups based on what we see on the surface. But here's the truth, those lines are meaningless when it comes to true worth. It's not the clothes you wear or the car you drive that define you. It's not the title on your business card or the number of followers on your social media account. What defines you is your character, your integrity, and how you treat others. Kevin's mistake was in thinking that because Will Smith wasn't dressed in a suit or surrounded by bodyguards, he was less important. Kevin's arrogance blinded him to the possibility that greatness doesn't announce itself with fanfare, it's subtle. It's quiet. It's often overlooked, until it makes itself known. In this story, Will was not just a celebrity walking into a restaurant. He was a man who, despite the fame and fortune, had the humility to live his life with kindness and respect. Will didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need to flaunt his success or his influence. His greatness was in his actions, his words, and his ability to remain calm in the face of unfairness. Will's true power lay in his response to Kevin's disrespect. Instead of retaliating with anger or humiliation, he chose grace. And that choice left a lasting impact on the world. What does this story teach us? It teaches us that no matter where we are in life, no matter how high or low our status may seem, we are all worthy of respect. The lesson here is simple: treat others as you would want to be treated. It's a lesson we often hear growing up, but sometimes, it's easy to forget in the rush of life. But what happens when we forget? When we forget, we end up like Kevin, caught up in our own sense of superiority, failing to recognize that our actions matter. We become so focused on how we see ourselves that we stop considering how others see us. And when that happens, we might just make a mistake so big that it changes everything. It was only when Kevin saw the consequences of his actions, the empty restaurant, the loss of his job, the damage to his reputation, that he understood the weight of his mistake. But by then, it was too late to undo what had been done. The damage had already been done. His pride had cost him everything he once held dear. In contrast, Will's response was a testament to the power of humility. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't seek to tear Kevin down or make him feel small. Instead, he responded with kindness, showing the world that greatness doesn't need to shout to be heard. Will didn't need to explain his worth, he just showed it through his actions. His grace, in the face of the worst kind of public humiliation, was what truly made him stand out. When Will spoke at the charity event, his words were not just a message for Kevin, they were for all of us. Everyone deserves kindness, he said. Sometimes, it's just about showing up with an open heart. In a world that often feels divided and quick to judge, those words were a reminder that we can always choose to lead with empathy. We can choose to be the person who listens, who understands, who forgives. Will didn't need to prove anything to the world. He had already earned his place through years of hard work, talent, and integrity. But in that moment, he chose to rise above the drama. His simple act of kindness was more powerful than any flashy response. It was a quiet strength that showed the world what true greatness looks like. And let's not forget the ripple effect of this story. When Will responded with grace, the world responded in kind. His message went viral because people were starving for examples of kindness in a world that often seems to reward cruelty. The story of Kevin's downfall and Will's rise became a powerful lesson for many. People began to reflect on their own actions, their own words. Were they treating others with the same respect they wanted for themselves? Were they quick to judge based on appearances, or were they taking the time to see the person beneath the surface? The lesson was simple, but profound: how we treat others matters more than we sometimes realize. And when we choose to lead with kindness, we make the world a better place for everyone. Will didn't just teach us a lesson about humility, he taught us that our words and actions can change the course of someone's day, or even their life. As for Kevin, his fall from grace was not just a result of his treatment of Will, it was a wake-up call for all of us. It's easy to get caught up in our own success and forget the importance of humility. It's easy to assume that the power we hold, or the position we occupy, makes us better than others. But that kind of thinking leads only to disappointment and regret. The true measure of greatness is not how high we rise, but how we treat others along the way. If we let our pride blind us, we risk losing everything we've worked for. Kevin had to learn the hard way that kindness and respect are far more valuable than any title or position. And for Will, his quiet response was a reminder that the best way to handle adversity is with grace. He showed us that even in the face of disrespect, we have the power to choose how we respond. In the end, this story isn't just about two men, one who failed, and one who rose above. It's about all of us. It's about the choices we make every day in how we treat the people around us. It's about the small moments where we can choose to be kind, to show respect, and to be humble, even when it's hard. As we move through our own lives, let's remember Will's example. Let's remember that greatness doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be flashy. It doesn't need to be wrapped in fame or fortune. True greatness is found in the quiet moments, in the way we treat others when no one is watching, in the way we rise above the noise and choose to be better. And if we fall, if we make a mistake like Kevin did, we don't have to let it define us. We can learn from it. We can make it a turning point, a chance to grow and become better people. Because, in the end, it's not about where we start or what we have, it's about how we choose to treat the people around us. That's what really matters. So, let's show up with open hearts. Let's choose kindness. Let's lead with humility. And in doing so, let's create a world where everyone is treated with the respect they deserve. That's the legacy we all can leave. And that's how we make the world a better place.